He came to me asking for help, but I didn't realize I was the one who needed it most. The office hummed softly, a mix of muted conversation and the occasional clack of a keyboard. I was reviewing the schedule for the week when the door opened, and he walked in, tall, slightly awkward, and carrying that unmistakable aura of someone trying desperately not to be noticed. His eyes scanned the room nervously before settling on me. "If you liked my story, then subscribe my channel." There was something about the way he hesitated on the threshold, unsure if he belonged. Maybe it was the youth in his face, or the slight tremor in his hands as he clutched his notebook, but I felt an immediate pull, a subtle curiosity that tugged at the edges of my attention. I stood, offering him a small, welcoming smile. "Hi, I'm Olivia. You must be the new intern," I said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from my desk. He returned the smile, a little shyly, and nodded. "Yes, I'm Daniel. I hope I'm not in the way." Something about his sincerity, the quiet way he apologized before he even did anything wrong, drew me in. There was a raw honesty there, a softness beneath the nervousness that made me want to reassure him, to tell him it was okay to be himself here. He sat down, and as he set his notebook on the desk, our hands brushed briefly. It wasn't much, just the lightest contact, but I felt it, a small jolt that wasn't unpleasant, a fleeting warmth that lingered longer than expected. He glanced up at me, eyes wide, as if surprised by the touch. I offered a small, knowing smile. The first few minutes were all about introductions and logistics. He asked questions, careful and thoughtful, genuinely wanting to understand the workflow. But I noticed the way his eyes followed me occasionally, curious but respectful, as if he were trying to measure the distance between us without overstepping. I, in turn, found myself observing him, the tilt of his head when he concentrated, the subtle way he shifted in his chair, the little frown of focus that crossed his brow. There was no rush, no sudden drama, just a quiet, almost imperceptible pull forming between us. In his presence, I became more aware of the spaces I usually overlooked, the warmth of sunlight spilling across my desk, the soft scent of coffee drifting from the break area, the gentle hum of the office that somehow felt calmer now, somehow more intimate. By the time our short meeting ended, I realized something surprising. I had spent more time noticing him than anything else. And though it was just the first day, a quiet thought settled in my chest, unbidden. Perhaps this young intern had come for help, but somehow, I already felt that I might need him more than he knew. The following days passed quietly, each filled with the usual rhythm of the office, but with a subtle difference. Daniel wasn't just another intern. He was becoming someone I looked forward to noticing. It wasn't his youth alone, it was his attentiveness, the way he asked questions with genuine curiosity, the small gestures that betrayed his thoughtfulness. I caught myself observing him more often than I cared to admit. The way he tucked a stray strand of hair behind his ear while concentrating on his work, the slight crease in his brow when he didn't understand something immediately, the quiet care with which he handled every task, no matter how small. There was something achingly earnest about him, a raw sincerity that seemed rare in the bustling, self-assured energy of the office. One afternoon, as he approached my desk with a question about a project brief, his hand accidentally brushed mine as he handed over a folder. The contact was brief, almost negligible, but it made my pulse stutter, the faint warmth lingering long after he'd stepped back. I tried to play it cool, but I noticed him glance back, a fleeting curiosity, or perhaps awareness, flickering in his eyes. He asked me about phrasing in a proposal, genuinely unsure, and I felt a sudden urge to explain patiently, to guide him without condescension. His gaze stayed on mine, attentive, absorbing every word, every inflection. And when I laughed lightly at a minor misunderstanding, he chuckled too, soft and unassuming, and the sound seemed to settle in the quiet corners of the office. There was a rhythm forming between us, unspoken and subtle. I found myself anticipating his questions, looking forward to the slight awkwardness of his pauses, the gentle way he sought approval. And he, in turn, seemed to be learning more than just work tasks. He was learning the contours of my expressions, the way I gestured with my hands, the small inflections that betrayed my mood. Even when our hands didn't touch, there was a sense of closeness, an intimacy that didn't require words. Watching him adjust his sleeves, leaning over a shared document, or simply standing beside me while I explained something, I realized that the connection was quietly, profoundly growing. It wasn't dramatic, it was steady, like a slow dawn filling a room with light. By the end of the week, I caught myself lingering on his presence longer than I intended. There was a subtle longing in our interactions, a pull neither of us openly acknowledged yet, felt in the small shared spaces, the brief touches, the glances that lingered just a heartbeat too long, the quiet smiles exchanged across the office. It was becoming impossible to ignore. Daniel had arrived seeking help, but in truth, I was the one finding myself drawn into a quiet, unexpected need, one that had little to do with work and everything to do with his gentle, sincere presence. And though we were both careful, cautious, and aware of the boundaries, a quiet anticipation was settling between us, unspoken yet undeniable. The office felt quieter that evening, the usual hum softened into a gentle stillness. Most of the team had gone, leaving only the faint glow of desk lamps and the occasional click of keys in the distance. Daniel approached my desk, a little hesitant, holding a small stack of papers. I wasn't sure how to start this, he admitted, his voice low and earnest. I gestured for him to sit beside me, and as he did, I noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hands fidgeted with the papers. There was a vulnerability there that went beyond the nervousness of an intern. It was something quietly human, something that pulled at me. "Don't worry," I said softly, leaning closer over the desk. "Let's look at it together." As we bent over the documents, our elbows brushed. A warm, fleeting contact, but enough to make the air between us feel charged in a quiet, almost imperceptible way. I caught his gaze, just for a moment, and saw the same tentative awareness mirrored back at me. Neither of us spoke, but it felt like an acknowledgement of something unspoken, a shared understanding that went beyond work. The conversation shifted naturally from the papers to life beyond the office. He spoke quietly about feeling unsure of himself in new environments, about the pressure of proving he belonged. And without thinking, I shared some of my own vulnerabilities, how balancing professional expectations with personal dreams sometimes left me feeling isolated, even at my age. It was strange, this exchange. Here was a man several years younger, yet in that moment, I felt a profound connection. There was a softness to his attention, the way he listened, the subtle nods, the gentle encouragement in his tone. And as he spoke, I realized that he wasn't just asking for help with work, he was seeking understanding, guidance, and perhaps, unknowingly, a quiet human connection. Our hands brushed again when I pointed something out on the paper, and this time, neither of us moved away. There was a lingering warmth in the touch, a grounding sensation that made the quiet office feel intimate. I noticed the slight quickening of his breath, the way his eyes met mine just long enough for a pulse of recognition to pass between us. By the time he left, the room felt emptier yet fuller somehow. A tension had formed, subtle but undeniable, an emotional closeness that neither of us could ignore. I found myself replaying the brief moments of touch, the shared confidences, and the quiet intensity of our conversation. It was becoming clear, this wasn't just mentorship or guidance. Something deeper was unfolding, quietly, patiently. And while we both remained careful, respectful of boundaries, the vulnerability we'd shared had opened a door neither of us had expected, one that whispered of a connection that might be more than professional, more than ordinary. It was a rare Friday evening when the office had mostly emptied, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant chatter from the streets below. I had been reviewing a presentation when Daniel appeared again, this time holding a printed layout he needed me to check. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. There was something in the way he shifted from foot to foot, a slight nervous energy that made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't expecting. I nodded, setting aside my notes, and gestured toward the small lounge area. As he walked beside me, our shoulders brushed lightly. It was brief, accidental, yet it carried a warmth that lingered in the space between us. His eyes met mine, holding a quiet curiosity, and I realized with a start that I was just as aware of him as he was of me. We settled into the lounge, papers spread across the low table. I found myself leaning a little closer than necessary, explaining layout adjustments, pointing to margins and color schemes. And he leaned in too, our proximity allowing me to notice the subtle details of him, the way his hair fell slightly over his forehead, the concentration etched into his jawline, the way his eyes seemed to soften when he looked at me. There was a pause, a rare moment when neither of us spoke, just a faint rustle of paper as we both studied the same sheet. My hand reached instinctively to adjust a corner of the layout, and his hand followed, brushing mine lightly. The touch was fleeting yet electric, a gentle confirmation that neither of us wanted to break the contact. "Thanks," he said quietly, and for a moment, it wasn't about the project anymore. There was a vulnerability in his tone, a subtle acknowledgement that went beyond words. I found myself wanting to offer more than professional guidance, wanting to reassure him in a way that felt intimate but safe. We talked a little longer, our voices softer, our laughter lighter, less rehearsed. Each glance, each small gesture, carried meaning, the lingering look when he caught my smile, the subtle brush of his hand as he reached for a pen. It was as if we had stepped into a small, suspended world, where the usual rules of office formality no longer applied. When it was time to pack up, I noticed the hesitance in his movements, a reluctance to leave the shared space. I brushed a stray strand of hair from his forehead, a simple, gentle act, and our eyes met again. For a heartbeat, it was more than mentorship or guidance. There was a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement of attraction, tempered by mutual respect and a careful awareness of boundaries. As he finally walked away, I realized that this evening had changed something. The connection we had been building through small moments, quiet touches, and shared vulnerability had begun to crystallize. There was a first spark, not rushed, not dramatic, but steady, undeniable. And in that spark, I felt a fluttering anticipation of what might come, tempered by the awareness that both of us were navigating uncharted, delicate territory. The warmth of connection that had been building between us over the past weeks suddenly felt fragile. Monday morning brought the usual office bustle, but beneath the surface, there was a tension neither of us could ignore. Daniel's presence, once a source of subtle excitement, now carried the weight of unspoken questions, about propriety, about perception, about the impossible age difference between us. I watched him from across the room as he approached with a stack of files. His movements were careful, almost tentative, as if aware that the ease we had been sharing was now tempered by caution. I smiled lightly, trying to reassure him, but I could feel the hesitation in his eyes, a subtle shadow over the bright curiosity that had drawn me to him in the first place. "Olivia, do you have a moment?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. There was a pause, a slight tremor in the way he held the files, and I realized he was struggling with something beyond the project at hand. "Of course," I said, gesturing toward the corner where we had shared so many small, meaningful moments. As we worked side by side, there was a noticeable distance, an invisible barrier neither of us had erected consciously, but that lingered in the space between us. Our hands no longer brushed casually, our glances met only briefly. The warmth we had been cultivating seemed cautious now, tempered by the weight of external perception and internal doubt. He hesitated before asking for clarification, and I caught myself wanting to reach out, to close the gap that neither of us seemed willing to breach. But I didn't, because the world outside the office, the professional expectations, and the unspoken rules of propriety all pressed against the quiet intimacy we had begun to share. Later, I noticed him linger by the coffee machine, absently stirring his cup, his gaze distant. I wanted to approach him, to offer a comforting word or a reassuring smile, but the thought of crossing some invisible line held me back. And yet, every small gesture, every fleeting glance, reminded me that our connection had not vanished. It had only become more complex, layered with tension, uncertainty, and longing. We were both aware of the subtle push and pull. Each touch, each accidental brush of hands, now carried a weight, a question: could we navigate the delicate balance between professional boundaries and personal desire? The unspoken emotions simmered beneath the surface, felt and quickened breaths, lingering looks, and the small hesitations that punctuated our conversations. By the end of the day, I was left with a quiet ache of longing and uncertainty. Daniel had come to me seeking guidance, yet what I craved was something more profound, a reassurance that our connection could exist without judgment, without the constant interference of social expectation. And though either of us spoke the words aloud, I sensed that the next step, the moment where hesitation might finally give way to openness, was approaching. The conflict was no longer external. It was within us, an internal struggle between restraint and desire, between caution and the quiet hope that what was budding between us could survive the constraints of reality. It was late afternoon when the office emptied again, leaving a hushed quiet that felt almost fragile. I was reviewing some client feedback when Daniel appeared at the doorway, carrying a folder and a tentative expression that immediately made my chest tighten. He didn't say much at first. He simply walked toward me, each step deliberate, as if he were summoning courage from somewhere deep inside. "Can we talk for a minute?" he asked softly. His voice was careful, almost vulnerable, and I felt an unexpected flutter, a mixture of anticipation and fear. I nodded, gesturing toward the small lounge where we had shared earlier moments of connection. Once seated, there was a long pause. Neither of us spoke, yet the tension between us was tangible. The office lights reflected faintly in his eyes, revealing something unspoken, a hesitation that mirrored my own. Our hands rested near each other on the table, just barely brushing now and then, and each fleeting contact sent a quiet shiver of awareness through me. Finally, he spoke, his words deliberate and honest. I don't know how to say this without sounding foolish," he began, and I felt my pulse quicken. "But I feel something. I'm not just grateful for your guidance. I think I'm drawn to you. More than I expected." The honesty in his voice, the sincerity in his gaze struck me profoundly. For so long, I had tried to maintain composure, to remind myself of the boundaries, of the world's expectations. And yet, in this quiet room, with only the soft hum of the office surrounding us, the walls I had carefully built began to crumble. I reached out instinctively, placing a gentle hand over his. The warmth of his palm against mine was grounding, reassuring. "Daniel," I began, my voice soft but steady. "I feel it too." I wasn't sure how to admit it, or even if I should. "But these weeks, I've realized that I need you more than I thought I would." There was a pause, a shared breath, where the weight of unspoken emotions finally lifted. His fingers closed lightly over mine, a small, deliberate act that spoke volumes. It was intimate, but safe, a gesture that carried both reassurance and desire, a quiet promise that we were acknowledging the connection we had built. We talked then, honestly, vulnerably, about the complexities and uncertainties of our feelings. The age difference, the professional setting, the caution required, all of it came to light, but it didn't diminish the sincerity of what we felt. There was laughter, a few nervous glances, and long silences filled with the unspoken understanding that something rare and meaningful had begun to take root. When he finally stood to leave, we didn't part with a dramatic gesture. Instead, there was a gentle squeeze of the hand, a lingering look, and a quiet acknowledgement that the emotional barrier had been crossed. In that simple moment, the tension that had held us back for weeks dissolved, leaving only the warmth of connection, trust, and a tentative hope for what was to come. By the time he walked away, I realized that the slow, careful build of our feelings had reached its peak. The emotional climax wasn't a sudden rush. It was a quiet, profound understanding that we were no longer just mentor and intern. We were something more, fragile yet undeniable, and finally, ready to see where it might lead. The following morning, the office felt lighter, as if the air itself had shifted overnight. The unspoken tension of the previous weeks, the hesitant glances and lingering touches, had transformed into something steadier, something tender and deliberate. Daniel arrived at his usual time, but there was a subtle change, an ease in the way he moved, a quiet confidence in his eyes when they met mine. We exchanged our routine greetings, but this time, There was a warmth beneath the words, a shared understanding that went beyond mere professionalism. As he approached my desk, I noticed the small gestures that had become a language of their own, the slight tilt of his head when he listened, the careful attention in his posture, the brief but meaningful brush of his hand against mine as he passed the folder. "Morning," he said softly, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. There was no nervousness this time, no hesitation, just the quiet recognition of what had begun between us. We spent the morning working side by side, reviewing designs and presentations, the rhythm of our collaboration now accompanied by a gentle undercurrent of closeness. Every shared laugh, every brief touch, carried with it the memory of confessions, of late evenings spent speaking honestly and vulnerably. There was a comfort in the knowledge that the connection we had fought to acknowledge could now exist without guilt or hesitation. Later, during a brief break, we found ourselves walking outside for fresh air. The crisp morning sunlight illuminated the city streets, casting long shadows that intertwined with ours. Our steps matched naturally, and without thinking, our hands brushed again. This time, neither of us moved away. Instead, there was a quiet, unspoken agreement, a gentle acceptance of the bond that had grown over weeks of subtle moments, quiet glances, and shared vulnerability. "I'm glad we found this," he said softly, his voice carrying more than words. There was no need for dramatic declarations, just the honesty in his tone, the sincerity in the way he looked at me, and the warmth that radiated from the simple touch of his hand against mine. I smiled, a real, unguarded smile, feeling a quiet joy that was both comforting and exhilarating. "Me too," I replied. And in that single word, so much was conveyed: relief, hope, affection, and a recognition that what we had was rare and meaningful. As the day drew to a close, we returned to our workstations, but the air between us remained different, lighter, warmer, and undeniably intimate. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic proclamations, just the steady, quiet presence of two people who had navigated uncertainty, hesitation, and desire, and had come out with a bond that felt both real and enduring. By the time the office emptied for the evening, I found myself reflecting on how subtly and profoundly our connection had grown. What had begun as mentorship and professional guidance had blossomed into something much deeper, a slow, deliberate intimacy, nurtured with patience, vulnerability, and mutual respect. And as I watched Daniel leave, the memory of his hand brushing mine, the warmth of his gaze, and the softness of his smile stayed with me. It was a quiet, perfect ending, not rushed or exaggerated, but deeply satisfying. We had found each other in unexpected ways, and in that discovery, there was a gentle, enduring hope for what the future might hold, together, in a connection both tender and true.